I arrived in Bologna on a cloudless day, the sun casting a warm glow on the ancient cobblestone streets. I had heard about the beauty of the Basilica di San Petronio, but knew little of its dark history. My curiosity was piqued when I overheard some locals talking about the infamous Bell Tower, how it was closed to the public for years after a priest had fallen to his death. Some said he was pushed. Others whispered of a curse. That was enough to pull me in. The basilica itself was grand, towering over the piazza, but it was the bell tower that called to me. The door to the tower, though old and creaking on its hinges, was ajar, a soft breeze slipping through the crack like a whisper, beckoning. I couldn't resist. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The air changed immediately, cooler, thick with the weight of history and something else, something I couldn't name. The narrow stone staircase spiraled upward, dimly lit by faint slivers of sunlight. I climbed, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. But as I ascended, I started hearing something else, too. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. Footsteps, not my own, trailing behind me. I stopped, pressing my back against the cold stone. The steps behind me stopped, too. I held my breath, waiting, but there was only silence. Just my imagination, I told myself. But I quickened my pace, the thought of reaching the top suddenly less enticing, replaced by the urge to get out. Halfway up, the tower plunged into shadow. The few windows I passed now seemed too far apart, offering no relief from the growing darkness. And then a voice, a low murmur, broke the silence. It was a whisper, not in English, but I recognized the Italian. It said, "Bow, come closer." I froze. The voice came from above, but it wasn't the comforting call of another tourist or guide. It was cold, hollow, and distant, like it was coming from deep within the walls. A chill slid down my spine, but something compelled me to keep moving, as though the voice had latched onto my very bones. The higher I climbed, the more oppressive the air became. Each step felt heavier, like the weight of the tower itself was pressing down on me. And then, I saw something that made my heart stutter. A shadow just at the edge of my vision, darting up the stairs ahead. There was no way someone could have passed me without me noticing. I stood still, gripping the rough stone of the wall, eyes darting around the dim space. Nothing moved, but the sense of being watched was palpable. My breath came shallow as I continued upward, each step a force of will. At last I reached the belfry. The view of the city should have been magnificent, but the moment I stepped onto the platform, a wave of nausea hit me. It was like the air was poisoned. The bells hung overhead, silent and foreboding. The whisper returned, closer this time. "Look down." Against every instinct, I walked to the edge of the tower and peered over the railing. The drop was dizzying, and at that moment I felt it, something cold, like a hand, resting on my shoulder. My body stiffened as I whipped around. No one was there, but the pressure remained, pushing harder. I staggered back from the edge, heart racing. Suddenly, a loud metallic clang rang out as though one of the bells had been struck. My blood turned to ice. They hadn't rung for over a century, I had been told. My pulse pounded in my ears as the wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the tower. I wasn't alone. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time rushing toward me. I spun around, eyes wide, but there was nothing except the weight of something unseen closing in on me. I stumbled back, feeling the cold stone beneath my feet give way to open air as I neared the edge once more. And then, a voice, clear and unmistakable, whispered in my ear, "It's your turn." Before I could react, something slammed into me, sending me crashing against the railing. I gripped it with all my strength, my legs dangling over the edge as I tried to pull myself back up. But the pressure was relentless, like invisible hands were prying my fingers loose one by one. My heart hammered in my chest, and terror flooded every fiber of my being. As I hung there, I looked up, my breath hitching. For just a moment, I saw him, a figure cloaked in shadow, staring down at me with eyes hollow and black. The priest. He leaned closer, his breath cold against my skin as he whispered, "Fall." I jolted awake, gasping for breath, my heart still racing from the sensation of falling. The cold stone floor beneath me was real, solid, and unforgiving. I lay there for a moment, disoriented, trying to shake off the lingering terror that clung to my mind like fog. Had I fallen? No, I couldn't have. I was still here in the bell tower, alive. I sat up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through my shoulder. My head throbbed. The eerie quiet of the tower seemed louder than ever, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. The sunlight had dimmed. How long had I been out? My thoughts scrambled as I tried to recall what had happened. The shadow. The voice. That thing had pushed me, I was sure of it. But I was still here, not at the bottom of the tower in a broken heap. My hands trembled as I pushed myself to my feet, my knees weak, my body sore. I needed to leave. Now. But the stairwell leading back down looked impossibly dark, the air thick with something unseen but palpable, like walking through a nightmare that refused to let go. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I couldn't stay here. I had to move, had to escape. I stepped forward, the sound of my boots echoing ominously in the narrow corridor as I began my descent. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, and the deeper I went, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. A faint ringing sound buzzed in my ears, like the distant chime of bells, but not from the belfry above. These bells were different, smaller, almost like... My stomach turned as I realized it. They sounded like funeral bells. I picked up the pace, my feet moving faster than my mind could keep up. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows deeper, darker, and then without warning the whispers returned. Louder now, closer. "Why did you come?" the voice rasped. "Why won't you leave?" The words seemed to echo from all directions, making it impossible to pinpoint their source. My breath quickened, my pulse racing as I hurried down the winding staircase. But no matter how fast I moved, the whispers followed. "He's watching you." My foot slipped on the uneven stone and I tumbled down several steps, landing hard on my side. Pain shot through me, but I ignored it, scrambling to my feet, fear propelling me onward. I reached the landing of one of the upper levels, hoping to find some reprieve, but instead, I froze in my tracks. There, standing in the middle of the passageway, was a figure. The priest. His robes were tattered and filthy, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes nothing but black pits. He stood impossibly still, his gaze fixed on me. My body refused to move, trapped in his cold, dead stare. "Leave," he whispered, his voice crawling into my ears like ice water. "Or you'll fall too." I backed away slowly, but my feet felt heavy, as if the stone itself were gripping me, pulling me toward him. My mind screamed to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The priest began to move, not walking, but gliding toward me, his arms outstretched, fingers twisted into sharp, bony claws. I turned to flee, my heart hammering in my chest, but the stairwell behind me had disappeared. The tower shifted, the walls narrowing as I stumbled backward into an alcove. The shadows around me twisted and writhed, forming grotesque shapes, faces, limbs, all merging into one another as they swirled around me. The air turned thick with the stench of decay. Suddenly, a deafening clang reverberated through the tower. The bells! They shouldn't have rung, but the sound was unmistakable, loud, angry, vibrating in my bones. I clapped my hands over my ears, the noise unbearable. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The priest was no longer alone. Figures, dozens of them, began to emerge from the shadows. Gaunt, hollow-eyed forms, their faces twisted in agony. Some were missing limbs, others had deep gashes across their necks, their mouths open in silent screams. They moved slowly, surrounding me, their bony fingers reaching out, brushing my skin with cold, deathly touches. Terror gripped me as I pressed myself against the wall, trapped. The priest's voice echoed in the space between my panicked breaths. "This is your fate. You'll fall, just like I did." Suddenly, the air grew thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred as the shadows closed in, the figures now right in front of me, their dead eyes locking onto mine. The priest reached out his hand, and as his cold fingers grazed my throat, a sharp pain shot through my chest. I gasped, stumbling forward, the world spinning. And then, just as I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness, everything went silent. I blinked, confused. The figures were gone. The priest had vanished. The stairwell was back, the oppressive air had lifted, and I was alone. But I knew better. This wasn't over. Somewhere far below, I heard the sound of footsteps, growing louder with each passing second. Something, or someone, was coming for me. The footsteps below were unmistakable, echoing up the stone walls, climbing with a steady, relentless rhythm. Whoever or whatever it was getting closer. I wiped the cold sweat from my brow, my breathing shallow and ragged. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The tower felt like a living thing, its walls tightening, suffocating me with the weight of centuries-old secrets. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself, listening as the footsteps slowed. My heart raced in the silence that followed, each beat pounding louder than the last. Then, from somewhere down the staircase, I heard it again. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come." My stomach lurched. The voice was different this time. It was no longer the priest. This voice was colder, darker. It didn't feel human. I peered down the stairwell, but the shadows were too thick. The narrow sliver of light from the windows was barely enough to illuminate the twisting steps. I couldn't see anyone or anything coming, but I knew it was there, waiting, watching. I had to move. I forced myself away from the wall and started down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I descended, faster and faster. The air grew heavier with each turn, the temperature dropping so rapidly that my breath now formed clouds in front of me. The bell tower wasn't that tall. I should have reached the bottom by now, but the stairs seemed to stretch on endlessly. My surroundings felt warped, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare that refused to let me wake. My steps became frantic, and I could hear the faintest whisper of voices all around me, overlapping in a terrifying symphony of despair. "He's coming for you. You can't escape. You'll fall too." I stumbled, catching myself on the cold, jagged wall. My hands scraped against the stone, and when I pulled them away, they were slick with blood, but I barely felt it. The fear had numbed everything but the drive to keep moving. Suddenly, the walls shuddered. A low, groaning sound reverberated through the tower, as if the entire structure was alive, straining under the weight of some unseen force. The stairs beneath me cracked, and I heard the unmistakable sound of stone breaking apart. Then a deafening boom rang out, the sound of a bell. But this time, it wasn't the eerie chime of before. This was different, louder, sharper. It reverberated through my chest like an explosion, and the tower seemed to buckle beneath its weight. The floor beneath my feet cracked wide open. I screamed as I fell, tumbling into darkness. My hands scrambled for anything to hold on to, but the stone was too smooth, too slick. The wind rushed past me as I plummeted, and for a moment I was weightless, falling deeper and deeper into the abyss. Then, with a bone-rattling crash, I landed hard on something cold and unyielding. My vision swam and pain shot through my entire body. I groaned, gasping for air as I rolled onto my back, struggling to make sense of where I was. The darkness was overwhelming, and the only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. I blinked, trying to clear my head, but the world around me remained pitch black. I couldn't tell if I was still in the tower or somewhere else entirely. Then a voice pierced the silence. "You're almost there." I bolted upright, my body trembling with adrenaline. The voice was too close, far too close. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, but I saw nothing. I was in a vast open space. No walls, no stairwells, just an endless void. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something. A faint glow, pulsing rhythmically in the distance, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. The source of the light became clearer as I stumbled toward it, each step a painful struggle. It was the outline of a figure, hunched over in the center of the room, bathed in an unnatural light that flickered like a dying candle. As I approached, the figure slowly turned, revealing a face that made my blood run cold. It was the priest, but this time his face was twisted in a grotesque mask of pain and rage. His eyes, black, hollow, endless voids, locked onto mine, and I froze, my feet rooted to the spot. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of words, a guttural, inhuman growl escaped his throat. His jaw unhinged impossibly wide, and from the darkness of his gaping mouth, something began to emerge. I watched in horror as pale, skeletal hands clawed their way out of his mouth, pulling themselves free. The priest's body convulsed, his form distorting as something far worse than I could have imagined crawled out of him, its bony limbs twisted and unnatural. It stood before me, towering, its face a grotesque mimicry of the priest's, but stretched and elongated, its features warped by centuries of torment. Its eyes, those black, soulless pits, burned into me. "You shouldn't have come." It rasped, the voice like nails scraping against stone. The floor beneath me began to tremble, and I felt the cold, icy grip of something wrap around my ankle. I screamed, kicking frantically as I looked down. Out of the floor, dozens of skeletal hands were reaching up, pulling at me, dragging me down. I fought to break free, but it was no use. Their grip tightened, pulling me closer to the grotesque figure that now loomed over me, its face inches from mine. It leaned in closer, and in a voice that sent shivers down my spine, it whispered, "You'll fall just like he did." And then, without warning, I was yanked downward, the ground beneath me giving way as I was swallowed by the shadows. As I disappeared into the abyss, the last thing I heard was the distant, echoing sound of the bell. The darkness closed around me, suffocating and cold, but just as I thought I'd be consumed by it forever, something changed. The grip of those skeletal hands slackened, their icy hold retreating. I gasped, expecting to feel the endless fall into nothingness, but instead I landed softly, on solid ground. The shadows that had threatened to swallow me whole dissipated like mist in the sunlight. I blinked, adjusting to the sudden brightness. Slowly, I rose to my feet and looked around, stunned by what I saw. I was no longer in the tower. I stood in a sunlit courtyard, bathed in warmth, the oppressive chill and malevolent presence gone. Around me were lush green trees swaying gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly. The air smelled sweet, a sharp contrast to the stale, ancient air of the bell tower. It was as if I had stepped into another world, a peaceful one, untouched by the horrors I had just faced. My heart still raced, adrenaline pumping through my veins, but there was no immediate threat. No whispers, no shadows, just calm. I took a hesitant step forward, unsure of where I was or how I had escaped. As I did, a figure appeared in the distance, walking toward me. My breath caught in my throat, but this time there was no dread. Instead, a strange sense of peace washed over me. The figure drew closer, and I saw that it was the priest. But he looked different now. His face, no longer twisted in anguish and rage, was serene, almost gentle. His black, hollow eyes had been replaced by bright, kind ones. He looked at me with a soft smile that seemed to erase the terror of what had happened. He stopped a few feet away, studying me for a moment before he spoke. His voice was calm, soothing, and no longer filled with malice. "You have freed me." His words hung in the air, light as a breeze. I stared at him, confused. Freed him? I had been moments away from being dragged into the same fate that had consumed him. "The curse," he continued, as if sensing my confusion. "It was never about the tower. It was about my soul. I was trapped in my final moments, reliving the fall, consumed by the bitterness and rage of my death." He paused, and a shadow passed over his face, though it was fleeting. I could not rest until someone came who could break the cycle. I frowned.
"But I didn't do anything. I was just trying to escape."
The priest shook his head gently. "You resisted the fear, the darkness. Most who come to the tower are consumed by it, but you fought. That's what broke the hold it had over me." He gestured around us. "This place, it's where I've longed to be. You've given me peace." For the first time since I'd entered the bell tower, I felt a sense of clarity. The terror that had gripped me now seemed distant, as though it had been lifted. The priest's presence wasn't threatening, it was a comfort, like speaking to an old friend. "And what about me?" I asked cautiously. "How do I leave?" The priest smiled again, that same gentle smile. "You've already found the way out." He stepped back, and as he did, the courtyard around me shimmered, the edges blurring as if it were all part of a dream. The trees, the sunlight, the peaceful calm, it all began to fade, replaced by the familiar stone walls of the tower. But the oppressive darkness, the terror that had clung to the air, it was all gone. I blinked, and suddenly I was back at the base of the bell tower, standing in the wide, empty piazza. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the square. I stood there for a moment, stunned, unsure if what had happened had been real. But my scraped hands, still bloodied from the fall, were proof enough. I looked back at the bell tower, towering above me, its silhouette stark against the fading light. For a moment I thought I saw a figure standing at the top, watching me. But as I blinked again, it was gone. The curse was broken. The priest was free. I took a deep breath. The weight that had pressed down on me all day now lifted, replaced by a strange, quiet peace. I had come here searching for history, for something different, and instead, I had found something much more profound. With one last glance at the bell tower, I turned and walked away, the warm breeze at my back, knowing I had survived something ancient and dark, and had helped free a soul trapped for far too long. As I left the piazza behind, the last rays of sunlight washed over the city, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt truly safe. The terror was over, the curse was broken, and I had made it out alive.